Welcome back, guys. In this video, we'll be looking at while loops. Just as the name suggests, a while loop executes a piece of code while a condition is true. Now, if you remember the for loop, we didn't really need to initialize any variable beforehand. We could just do for I in the range of so-and-so, do this. But this isn't the case with while loops. When using while loops, we have to initialize the variable that we're going to use inside the loop. While loops are generally used when we don't know the number of times we have to iterate over something. And when using while loops, we have to initialize the variable that we're going to use in the loop. So let's directly see an example. So since we're in the Jupyter Notebook, we're going to use a while loop to print out the numbers from 1 to 10. So I is equal to 1, while I is less than or equal to 10, colon, print I is equal to I plus 1. Let's see if this runs. Yep, and as you can see, it prints out all the numbers from 1 to 10, as was expected. So in this piece of code, we're basically telling Python that, hey Python, the value of I is 1, and while I doesn't become equal to 10, keep printing I. So when I enters the while loop, it initially is equal to 1, since we initialize the value of I to 1 in the first statement. Now inside the while loop, we have two statements. First one is to print out whatever the value of I is. And second statement is to increment I by 1. So this can also be written in a shorthand version, which is I plus equals 1. These two things are exactly the same thing. This is just a shorthand version of writing I is equal to I plus 1. So initially, I is equal to 1. I enters the while loop when it is 1. So 1 is less than or equal to 10. The condition is true. So it goes inside and executes whatever is inside the code, inside the while loop. So it prints out I. So I is 1. So 1 is printed onto the screen. Next, I becomes equal to 2 since I is equal to I plus 1. So we're assigning the value of I to I plus 1. So initially, I was 1. So now I becomes 2 since 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. And try to remember this notation because it's used more often than the first one. Next, I becomes 2 and the condition is still true. It prints out I, which is 2, to the screen. And this continues until I becomes 10. And 10 less than or equal to 10 is still true. And then 10 is incremented to 11. And then 11 less than or equal to 10 is false. So condition becomes false and the while loop stops. So this is basically how a while loop works. Now, to make things a bit more interesting, we can also introduce nested if statements in a while loop. For example, let's say we want to print only odd numbers from 0 to 10. In that case, I'm going to initialize I to 0 since I want numbers from 0. Then I'm going to say while I is less than or equal to 10 because I want the range of 0 to 10. Colon, don't forget the colon. And notice the indentations of all the statements. So if I mod 2 is equal to, does not equal to 0 actually, colon, enter, print I. Well, let's see if this works. I need to increment. let's see if this works. And it does. It printed out all the numbers, all the odd numbers from 1 to 10. So in this piece of code, what we did was we initialized I to 0, and we put up a while loop saying while I is less than or equal to 10. And we introduced a second condition using the if loop saying that if I mod 2 does not equal to 0, print I. So basically what we're saying is if I is not even, print I. We know that if I is not even, it's obviously going to be odd. So we printed that out. And of course, we use this condition over here since we don't want an infinite loop. And we want to increment I every time, because the while loop doesn't increment values all by itself. So now the if condition in this while loop checks if the number is odd or even and accordingly prints it out, or it doesn't print it out. So initially I0, which is less than or equal to 10, condition is true, goes inside if loop. So 0 mod 2 does not equal to 0. Well, the condition is false, and this statement is not executed. So it moves on to this statement and increments I by 1. So I becomes 1. So 1 less than or equal to 10, condition is still true inside the while loop. And then inside the if loop, we have 1 mod 2 does not equal to 0, which is true. And basically, so the condition is true, and so it prints it out to the screen. So we have 1 on the screen. I becomes 2 from this statement. 2 is less than or equal to 10, true. But this condition becomes false, so it doesn't print out 2 to the screen. And this continues until I becomes equal to 10. So 10 less than or equal to 10 is still true, but since 10 is even, this condition becomes false, and 10 is not printed to the screen. Next, I becomes equal to 11, and finally, this condition becomes false, and the while loop stops. So one thing we got to make sure is that we're using a terminating condition in the while loop. By a terminating condition, I mean something which changes the initial value of I, or basically increments or decrements the value of I, or any initial variable used for that matter. Because if we don't, well, Python will just be dizzy, and so will you, creating problems. I'll show you how it can become dizzy. Let's just copy this part here. And let's not include this condition. So I'm not incrementing I infinite times stays 0. And this condition is always true because 0 is always going to be equal to or less than or equal to 10, like anytime you check. So we have an asterisk mark over here. Basically, it won't print it out because it will go into an infinite loop. Okay, so that's it about while loops. Thanks for watching this video and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.